The most important battle right now is over the upcoming U.S. dietary guidelines for adults. Statutorily, they are supposed to be updated every 5 years. That means by the end of the year, the Trump administration is supposed to give us new U.S. dietary guidelines for adults. And I want to emphasize how important this is because you might think, I'm sitting here in Milan. Why do I care what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. thinks how many drinks a woman can have in the U.S.? Well, the reason
Right.
for this, I can prove this to you as soon as you get in front of your computer. If you search for how much alcohol is safe to drink, the top answers are generally going to be based on the US dietary guidelines for adults. That is the touchstone people go to. That's why
Right.
neo-prohibitionist movement has been fighting so hard to get them changed. It's why Joe
Hmm.
Biden, who was profoundly anti-alcohol, tried so hard
Right.
to get them changed. Even basically Biden tried to do an end around US law to do it. So this is a very important battle, and we don't know how it's going to come out until it does.
Hello, welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, your host, Juliana Colangelo. This show has been designed to demystify the US market for Italian wineries through interviews with experts in sales and distribution, social media, communications, and so much more. We will quiz each of our esteemed guests in every episode to solidify the lessons that we've learned from the episode. So sharpen your pencils, get out your notebooks, and join us this week to learn more about the US market. Hello, welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today we're diving into one of the most pressing and sometimes controversial topics, so let's say all the time, facing our industry, the rise of the neo-prohibition movement. From shifting public health narratives to changing consumer attitudes, wine is being challenged in many ways in this year, 2025. To help us unpack what's happening, I'm joined by Blake Gray, U.S. editor of WineSearcher.com. He's one of the sharpest and keenest and smartest industry observers, and I've known Blake personally for over a decade, so I think I can say that. Someone who's been at the forefront of these issues and really covering them extremely closely. So we're very lucky to have Blake here to share his insights specifically right now on how politics, policy, and perception is shaping the US wine industry, but also shaping opportunities for international and Italian wineries in particular to come to market. So, Blake, thank you very much for joining us today. It's really great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. I love Italian wine and love going to Italy. And, I want to see Italian wineries succeed in the U.S. market.
So do we, of course. And Blake, actually, it is September 2025. We met a decade ago exactly in South Africa on Cape Wine trip.
Hey, yes, that was a great trip. Yeah,
That
that
was
was
an
a lot
amazing
of
trip.
fun.
Yes, that seems like a lifetime ago, but that was incredible. It was great. So obviously Blake and I know each other well, but for our listeners, Blake, that don't know you as well, just give us, your brief background and how you ended up sitting in the position you do today as a wine journalist.
So I started my career as a police and courts journalist, which is going to explain, how I end up following all these court cases. I'm one of the few wine reporters who has any experience of doing it with stories that are not about wine. And then I decided I want to do more fun stuff. So I moved to sports reporting. And then, like a few other sports writers, there's actually quite a tradition in US media of sports writers deciding, hey, wine is even more fun. So I started writing about wine. Actually, I started writing about sake when I lived in Japan. It was my first time writing about alcohol. I started writing about wine probably a little over 20 years ago. And it's been my primary thing for most of that time since. I've been really fortunate because very, very few people make a living
Yeah.
writing about wine these days. And I feel very fortunate to be in that extremely small group.
Yeah. And we're lucky to have you in the industry for the really thorough reporting that you're doing. And so, to our listeners, we're eager to learn from him about how politics are shaping the wine industry today. So, our three key takeaways that we're excited to learn from Blake are: number one, what is the status of the neo prohibitionist movement right now and recent updates on FDA guidelines as they apply to wine? Number two, we'll talk to Blake about generational shifts and how the wine industry is keeping up, keeping political regulations in mind. And finally, number three, what's on the horizon? There's always something ahead and to be on the lookout for next when it comes to how policy and politics are shaping the wine industry in the US. So, Blake, let's just start with the status and overview. It's September 15th, 2025. Where do we sit today with the neo prohibitionist movement that's happening in the US? Can you walk us through a little bit what's happening right now? We have covered this topic before quite extensively, so give us an update on what's happening at the moment.
Well, the most important battle right now is over the upcoming U.S. dietary guidelines for adults. Statutorily, they are supposed to be updated every 5 years. That means by the end of the year, The Trump administration is supposed to give us new U.S. dietary guidelines for adults. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the health secretary, is in charge of this. There's been a lot of talk about what they may or may not say. And I've been covering this issue as deeply as anyone, and I don't have any idea what they're going to say at this point. It's been reported that Kennedy wants to make them a lot shorter. The 2020 guidelines were 156 pages long. Kennedy said to Congress in May, I believe, that he thinks they're going to be 4 pages long, and they're going to say, eat food that's good for you. They have given specific amounts that would be safe to drink. And there's the standard ones you see a lot of places. 2 drinks for adult males, 1 drink for adult females as moderate drinking. We don't know. It's possible that they'll say that again. It's also possible that they might just say drink in moderation, and it's possible they won't say anything at all. Kennedy's had a history of substance abuse, so we don't know how he's going to look at the issue. On the other hand, the Trump administration is very anti-regulation. To come down hard on alcohol, even though Trump himself is not a drinker, he does not drink, but to come down hard on alcohol is not the sort of thing that the Trump administration is politically inclined to do. And I want to emphasize how important this is, because you might think, I'm sitting here in Milan. Why do I care what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. thinks, how many drinks a woman can have in the U.S.? Well, the reason for this, I can preview this to you as soon as you get in front of your computer. If you search for how much alcohol is safe to drink, the top answers are generally going to be based on the U.S. dietary guidelines for adults. Now, you can look for it in a different way, but it is the basis, and way outside the U.S. And the U.S. is the world's most important wine market, so that would be important by itself. But the U.S. dietary guidelines for adults are repeated everywhere in the English-speaking world. And frankly, outside the English-speaking world, that is the touchstone people go to. That's why the neo-prohibitionist movement has been fighting so hard to get them changed. It's why Joe Biden, who was profoundly anti-alcohol, tried so hard to get them changed. Even basically, Biden tried to do an end around U.S. law to do it. So this is a very important battle, and we don't know how it's going to come out until it does.
Right. Yeah, and it's scary, and like you said, a lot of unknowns still. But Blake, can you talk to us a little bit, especially for our listeners in Italy? We all know here in the U.S. how much of politics is influenced by lobbyists and by big interest groups. What is going on right now for the wine, and I'll extend it to spirits too, because of course that's huge for this as well. What is going on in Washington D.C. around political lobbying around this issue? How is the industry fighting for itself and standing up for itself with these conversations happening, and with 3.5 months left in the year before these decisions are reached?
It's a good question. So I have a lot of conversations with people on and off the record. And what I'm going to say is a summation of a feeling that I get. I would report this, so I'm not going to say this is not something I could say in print, but it is completely from off the record conversations. I am struck by the powerlessness of people who usually feel pretty powerful in lobbying. I talk to people who have influence, and they just don't sound confident. You have a change in administration with the Trump administration. You have Kennedy, who's a bit of a wild card. And I think the people who are used to lobbying aren't sure who to go to and how to approach them. So that's part of why this is a very important moment for the next 5 years and maybe even beyond in alcohol regulation. It's interesting because the forces of prohibition, and if you want to know what prohibitionists think, you can always read Ronnie Rubin, the New York Times health reporter, because she just basically reports whatever the prohibitionists are. But in fact, that is a good way to keep up with what the prohibitionists are thinking. Yeah. She's their PR agent, basically. But, they don't know what's happening either. And that's why they're trying so hard. They're complaining that, the Trump administration is not taking us seriously. And the Biden administration did. So that gets into this. I do want to talk a little bit later about Republican and Democrat politics, because I think this matters when you're trying to sell wine. But the politics of alcohol is something I say all the time. They don't fit traditional party lines. The prohibitionist forces, a lot of them they're very liberal in other areas, and yet they think you shouldn't be drinking alcohol. And then you have people who are right-wing conservatives, and then some of them are very anti-alcohol. We're kind of used to that. It's interesting. Christianity in Italy is Christianity with wine. Christianity in the U.S. is not necessarily Christianity with wine. Evangelical Christianity is very different from Catholicism when it comes to wine. But then you have these very right-wing people who think that drinking is a personal freedom. So,
Mhm.
you just can't look at the prohibition battle along traditional Democrat Republican lines.
Yeah, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about what you mentioned of the political divides, Democrat, Republican, when it comes to policy and politics in the alcohol beverage industry. How do you see the parties differentiating and approaching these topics, whether it's of course, we're talking about neo-prohibitionists and FDA guidelines, but not to mention tariffs. That's been on everyone's mind, perhaps more than usual these days. How do the two political parties differ and also come together around these topics?
Well, I want to say something I said before that I don't think a lot of people reported on, but Joe Biden was profoundly anti alcohol, more
Yeah,
anti alcohol than any US politician I can. Well, I don't know if that's fair. US politician, no. I can remember politicians who were more anti alcohol, but certainly more anti alcohol than any president I can remember or any
right.
major party leader I can remember. And that, how much does Biden represent the Democratic Party way of thinking? I mean, not really, right? The Democratic Party is way more complicated than the Republican Party.
Yeah,
And in
major
fact, the
fractured
Democrat
and
a bit at war with itself right now. You see some of
exactly.
this in Europe, you have a Green Party, and in the US, we don't. So we have, basically our Green Party and what would be your kind of liberal Democrats, and they're in the same party and they don't agree on things.
Hmm.
Um, that's interesting. But the parties hate each other a lot. Unfortunately,
Especially
it's a
right now.
bad week for this that we're recording this. We're seeing a lot of that break out into violence. They hate
I
each
know.
other a lot, and a lot of times they will take the opposite position just to take it. And in a sense, I'm going to say this hasn't been bad for the alcohol industry because when you have Republicans running Washington and they know Joe Biden had this position, it is just their natural tendency to have the other position.
Right, to swing the pendulum back the other way. But we're not
Right.
necessarily seeing that right now, which like you said is it's harder category or topic to draw party lines on, which makes this even harder to draw some predictions on. But I think just understanding the background is incredibly useful and helpful in itself. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Blake. Can you touch on the global importance of the US FDA guidelines around drinking alcohol and regulations? But how do you think this is changing the way the US consumer in particularly perceives wine and let's say health and just wellness aspect of wine, all the news that's been coming out recently?
Well, again, I would think the New York Times health reporter is probably as impactful as any government statement. And, she writes things like there's an emerging consensus that no amount of alcohol is safe when there is no such consensus. And that's in our number one. I mean, New York Times is pretty much unquestionably our number one newspaper, and that's in there all the time. And I think that does have an impact. Young people are drinking less. And when polled, they're falling for this propaganda that, I want to say I think I've read a lot about wine and health. I believe I understand it on a pretty complex level. And for public health, if you're looking at it from the WHO's perspective or any country like England that has National Health Service, sure. If you can reduce the country's drinking, it's good for the country. You have less alcoholics, you have less binge drinking. These are the most dangerous alcohol behaviors for sure.
Right.
You don't want
Mhm.
that. But we're losing the idea that people have in Italy that, enjoying a glass of wine with your dinner, the research continues to show that moderate drinking is better for you. I mean,
Yes.
I'm just going to say this better because it reduces your all cause mortality. And yes, it does increase your risk of cancer. That's been shown, but it reduces your risk of heart disease, which is the number one killer of Americans. And unfortunately, a lot of reporting on health is just stopping at, alcohol increase your risk of cancer. Fine. But, reduce your risk of heart disease. It's a trade off. So, but young people are a little bit more resistant. They also have more choices than they've ever had that don't involve alcohol. Not only do we have more interesting non-alcoholic cocktails now, but we have cannabis. A lot of states we have legal cannabis. It's not necessarily competitive for wine because you can smoke weed and drink wine in the same evening, and a lot of people do. But we also have things. I got this PR email this morning for somebody's coming up with an adaptogenic mocktail that has no alcohol, but it's going to
Of
have
course.
some sort of unresearched, impact on your performance. And people buy into that. And this stuff didn't exist a
Right.
generation ago. Nobody was selling me psychedelic mushrooms are legal in some states now. Nobody was selling me legal cannabis, so
Right.
young people just have a lot more choices.
And
I
as you
think,
said, there's this whole space that's highly unregulated of these functional beverages that say they cure lots of things and, boost your metabolism and your energy and even your libido, and right? And they're totally unproven and there's really limited regulations in that space, yet they continue to market and attract consumers. I mean, there is now a bar in Greenpoint, Brooklyn that only will serve non-alcoholic beverages. And I listened to an interview with the founder, who happens to be a Bravo TV star. So of course he's a PR machine already. But in his interview, he said, "Oh, and our drinks will also have functional benefits as well, like electrolytes and boosting this and boosting that." So people are buying into this. They're creating businesses around it, and it's working. And I wonder, Blake, what you think about how the wine industry in particular is responding to these challenges. Do you think that as an industry, we're doing enough to really position that message, like you mentioned earlier, of wine as a part of culture, wine as a part of your meal, gastronomy, wine in moderation? Do you think we're doing enough as an industry overall to communicate these values, number one? And part two of that question is to communicate them to new audiences who are so susceptible to cannabis and all these other options that are out there.
well, it's when we're talking about the adaptogenic drinks. So one of the first things that occurs to me is you can't say legally the stuff about wine that they can say without any proof about their drinks, because there are rules about alcohol marketing, and that's really unfair. Because I'm not saying you should sell wine as a health product, but wine does have benefits, if nothing else, socialization and relaxation. And you can't even you
Right.
could say you could make some drink up on psychedelic mushrooms, and you could say it'll help you relax, and you can't really say that about wine. So that's a big handicap.
True.
The industry is definitely trying to work around it. There's a movement out here in California, Come Over October, where another big problem is that people used to drink wine when they used to have dinner at each other's houses. And since the pandemic, that hasn't really happened. So
Right.
that's been bad for wine. People don't have the kind of get togethers where they used to bring wine. I don't know. I think it's important. We shouldn't lose the sense that wine is fun and delicious. And I
Yeah.
think that reaching young people, if we're too cautious in talking about, Come Over October, to me seems like it's a little bit targeted more at older people. To reach young people, you may want to talk with your lawyers about what ads are going over the line, because you can't call wine a health product. But we should not
Right.
lose that aspect that wine is fun and delicious. And both of
Yeah.
those are important. Delicious is important, but so is fun. Wine is fun to drink,
Especially for
which
a younger generation, right? Drawing them in. I mean, I think our industry is so bifurcated. Like the natural wine industry exists almost in its own silo with its own
mm,
distributors, many restaurants and bars that only serve natural wine. But I'll say that the venues and events I've been to that I've seen the youngest consumer demographic at have been natural wine events. If you go to a natural wine fair, the average age is 30, and if you go to the tasting events of the big major wine publications, the average consumer age is more like 50 to 60. I mean, it's just no denying that, if you've experienced both types of events. So there's also, like you said, that aspect of fun that I think one side of our industry is perhaps appealing to more, and not just fun. I think it's also marketing and the way in which that they've marketed the product. I'm curious
yeah,
on
I
that
want to say
note.
something about this for a moment too. That
Yeah.
the natural wine could be the whole natural wine scene could be a real benefit for wine in general, and it's really not. And
Yeah.
I don't know how. And the reason is not that natural wine's interesting. I order them in restaurants myself, although I usually ask the sommelier to get me one that tastes good.
Funky,
But
not too funky, I usually
right.
say.
Exactly. I say
Yeah.
I don't want the taste of bacteria. But that said, I mean, they're interesting. They're fun. The problem is not with the problem is the way that natural wine people bash all other wine. It'd be fine to say we're different from conventional wine, but their marketing is like, oh, other wines are full of poison and things like
Yeah.
this. And I don't know how, there's this us and them, as you say, they're very siloed. It would help the industry to reach out to the natural wine people and say, hey, just stop bashing us.
Right.
You don't have to send people to drink conventional wine. But the problem, with natural wine is, some of them are good, some of them are horrible. Whatever
Right.
you want to say about conventional wine, few of them are horrible these days. There's a
Yeah.
sulfites there for a reason. So, I think natural wine brings in a lot of new consumers, but some of them walk away and never come back to wine. And,
Because
it
they
would be
taste something that doesn't taste like, that doesn't taste good, right? And I think that's what wine tastes like. And I think, you know what, I'd rather drink a high noon or a beer or something that I know has a consistent taste and I like when I order it. Or, I'd rather drink a cocktail where I'll get double the booze for my dollar in a restaurant, and I can order one cocktail instead of two glasses of wine, right? And everyone we know is very price conscious these days as well. So yeah, it's a conundrum, right? It's we'll add it to the list of challenges we're facing, but I do think there is an opportunity for more reaching across the aisle. I mean, maybe we can compare it to the political situation we were talking about earlier. I don't think it's quite as extreme as that, but like you said, I think there's opportunity for more collaboration for sure.
People should be working together. I mean, it's amazing to me how many my focus is, and it's interesting. The natural wine world is so siloed that it's hard for me to get inside of it. But I talk
Yeah,
to just so many growers who are growing organic grapes and blah 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 blah. They're farming sustainably, dry farming, et cetera, and yet they're dismissed as full of poison by the natural wine crowd because they add SO2 with bottling it.
it's crazy.
That it's really peace between those forces would help everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think it would. I'm curious, Blake, on that note, we talked about, you mentioned marketing earlier and going to, lawyers and thinking about ways to market wine and new ways that are still legal. So, like, if we had to rank them in a sense, we've got warning labels potentially coming onto wine labels, not just here, but in Europe, stricter marketing, the FDA guidelines, and even restrictions on availability. I heard that now in certain stadiums in Europe, you can't get a glass of wine or any alcohol anymore. What policy trends do you think pose the greatest risk, let's say, for the wine industry, here in the US and potentially, abroad as well?
But I'm shocked with how anti-wine the establishment in France has gotten. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Now they can't show people. I was just talking about making wine fun, but in France, you're not allowed to show people enjoying a glass of wine in a country that is the equal of Italy and having had wine the bulwark of its culture. And you can see the impact this has had because if you look at any statistics for wine drinking in France, it's way down. So, something like that. Of course, people in France have much more of a culture and history with wine, but it's going away fast. Young people in France aren't drinking wine either. I actually think that it's a worse. I think this is a worse problem in Europe right now than
Yeah.
in the U.S. And that has something to do with, again, the Trump administration. I'm a Democrat. I didn't vote for him. I'm not going to pretend that I did. But if you want to see a business working in a deregulatory environment, I guarantee you, I talk to a lot of wine businesses, and there are reasons they're happy that Trump is in there. The kind of anti-alcohol campaign Macron has done in France, I just find that hard to imagine in the U.S. under the Trump administration.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And I think there's something you touched on, Blake, is definitely true. What's happening in Europe is even perhaps more extreme than what's going on here as far as the health restrictions and regulations around wine and also decline in consumption. It's a real issue really globally. But, do you think there's anything, let's try to end on a more positive note. And are there any, if we can, anything you think from all the reporting and research and reading you've done that you think producers today and maybe Italian producers in particular can do to stay relevant amidst all these policy concerns that are happening?
Well, so every generation tries to not be their parents, and I strongly believe wine is going to rebound. This isn't going
Me
to be a
too.
comfort to growers who are struggling right now because I don't know if it's going to rebound in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. But
Right.
every generation doesn't want to be the same as their parents. So this is part of the reason natural wine is big, right? I mean, people wanted to get something that they didn't want to drink their mom's Chardonnay.
Right.
And that's still going to be an option. So if we are developing a bit of a persnickety nanny state parent bunch who are like, oh, wine is bad for you, it stands to reason to me that their kids are going to be, hey, bring on that wine.
The
You know,
pendulum will swing again.
pendulum swings again. Italian wine, the whole idea of the quality and the history and tradition, this is all there. It's not going away. And I like that about Italian wine that, not pursuing too many fads of the moment when it comes to, we haven't talked at all about taste profiles, and I don't think we have to because I don't think that's how you pursue a new audience. You get Italian wine in front of people and allow them to enjoy it. I still think this is going to work. We haven't talked a lot about tariffs. I will tell you that I personally am very hopeful on this. I've done a lot of reporting on this. I think Trump's tariffs are all going to be shot down by the Supreme Court,
That's
and
hopeful.
it's
I hope you're
hopeful.
right.
And then he would have to go back in. Now, he can go in and reimpose tariffs using a different law, and maybe he
Right.
will, but he'll have to go back in and do what he did in the first term, which is hearings, and they can do this. And we could talk about this at some length, but that gives the alcohol industry and the restaurant industry, which is much more important, the ability to lobby the Trump administration again and say, hey, leave us out of this. And that worked in the first term. They were going to put 100%. Trump hates Macron, and he was going to put 100% tariffs on champagne just to piss off Macron. And the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance here basically talked him out of it with the statistic that I don't have in front of me, but something like every dollar that is spent on French wine, something like $4.57 goes to
Right.
U.S. companies. So, we keep
Yep.
bringing this out. We keep putting restaurateurs saying we need this Italian wine. U.S. Sangiovese is just not going to replace it. And
And
so I
these
imagine
restaurants need it more than us as an industry, right? If the with the stat that you just said, I mean that a lot of this dollars is funding, my job working for a wine importer that sells Italian and French wine, and the restaurant down the street selling those French and Italian wines, right? These are all US jobs, and continuing to reinforce that message, it will be really critical.
remember also that Trump owns hotels that have restaurants in them. He cares about the restaurant industry more than he cares about other industries. And I think when the tariff fight is reignited, and I do believe that it will, we need to let the restaurateurs stand out there and say, "Hey, don't tariff wine. We need that."
I've talked to some importers about tariffs, but I think it would be good to have, the journalistic perspective too. So maybe we'll do a part two. I'll think about timing on that.
This is a topic on which I can get really into the nitty gritty if people are interested.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
the big takeaway I would say is that if anybody in Italy wants to lobby their own government, don't do a digital service tax, because that's just inviting the Trump administration to retaliate. Or do a digital service tax, but don't have. The problem is it is clearly anti-American. I mean, came right out and said it. We're going to have this tax that targets GAFA, what Google, Amazon, Facebook. Don't do that. Have a digital service tax and have no minimum so that the French companies pay too, and then you won't be facing these tariffs.
What Ben Anef said on the last interview, he just said Italy actually is in the best position to lobby against the tariffs because of Giorgia Meloni's relationship with Trump, but do it more, backdoor, like, hey buddy, come on, help a lady out. We're on the same team. Come on, like really go at it more like politically like that. That's what he likes. That's his approach. That's his style. And she's got out of all the EU, she's got the best position. And she also has got one of the countries that has the most to lose with the tariffs, right? I mean, if you think
We
about
could go there if you want, but I think Merloni's in good position to beat. This is something Italy's never been the leader of Europe, but with the Trump administration, and Merloni has, Trump hates Macron, doesn't seem to get along with Starmer or, the Germans. He doesn't get along with anybody who's to his left. Merloni should be the voice. If Europe needs to talk to Trump, they should be going through her. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, yes, we all know flattery is the way to his heart.
yeah, definitely. Blake, I feel like we should maybe do a follow up on tariffs because I think we could have a whole separate conversation, but we are at time. So I do want to do our rapid fire quiz we do at the end of every episode and just ask you for this episode just one question because you already shared so much with us. Blake, what would be your number one tip for mastering the US wine market to our listeners?
It would be don't just go to New York and call it a day. That's by far it's a big wine market. It's a big international wine market. It's also by far the most competitive market in the US. There are Italian restaurants all over the US in states you're probably not thinking of: Nebraska, South Dakota, Indiana, wherever. They've all got restaurants. They've all got wine. The competition is less. Yeah, you may, I don't know how many pallets you could sell there a while, but I've talked to a number of wineries that are like, hey, we're the number one Chianti in Georgia, and that's a good, spot for us. So try to do that. Try to be, the number one Barbaresco in Nebraska. I mean, somebody's going to do it. Why not you?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think with recent movement, we've been talking about the impacts of COVID, but many people left big cities, including New York, and the southeast part of the US has gotten the largest population growth. So, think about those markets too. Like you said, Georgia, Florida, and not all the big ones too, like Tennessee, huge markets. So
But
great
one
advice.
thing I will say politically before we finish, don't think you can talk to your Texas distributors the same way you talk to your New York distributors.
Great advice, Blake. Absolutely. Great practical advice. Absolutely. To be safe, leave politics out of it. And then in those conversations, I would probably say.
Talk politics, but you probably shouldn't.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, Blake, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. How can our listeners follow along with you and your writing and all the great articles and important information that you're putting out there?
Go to Wine Searcher and click on where it says magazine, and that's where you'll see a lot of the work that I do.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Blake.
All right. Thanks, Juliana.
Thank you for joining me today. Stay tuned each week for new episodes of Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Juliana Colangelo. And remember, if you've enjoyed today's show, hit the like and follow buttons wherever you get your podcasts.